Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're just waiting for Dean Mostafavi, but I think we'll get started since you're all here. And I'm just going to say just a very few words. Um, so this talk is actually the first part of a two-part program on the countryside that's happening today. Um, the second event will happen at 6:30 back in this room. And the goal of this event is, which is actually the first in a series of events that we will do on the theme of the countryside, is to try to start a conversation about the rural and rurality, which often we see through the lens of urbanization and urbanism. So um, to that end, I'd like to introduce Christopher Lee. He's the co-founder and principal of Serrier Architects in London and Mumbai and Beijing. And he's associate professor of practice in urban design here at the GSD. And he's going to talk to us today about the countryside as the city.
Thanks, Chantal, and thanks everyone for coming. So this will be a really short presentation because I was told we need to leave the room at 1 p.m. today. So I'll be talking about actually the third and the last research and design studio on China, and this was conducted last fall as an option studio. So, although relatively recent in architecture and urban design school, the topic of China's rural urbanization is actually quite a vast one. So, with very limited time, I will cover very briefly the historical development of the Chinese countryside and the policies that had affected its physical transformation, but not too detailed. It will be published next week in this book. But really, I would like to just outline what's at stake, what is it in China with regards to rural urbanization, and to use a few examples in Zhongmao County in Henan Province, and also some of the propositions that we have done in last fall. So the countryside as a city. So the title itself, I would have to admit, is contentious, because to turn the countryside into a city is an act of foolery, if not outright scandal. Especially if the city is one of the dense, overdeveloped, speculated, and polluted coastal cities of China. But I believe the opposite to be true. The city and its qualities of prosperity, civility, and stimulation can be infused with the very essence of the countryside to transform the rural areas of China into a unique habitat. And in so doing, the entrenched contrast between the countryside and the city, the rural-urban divide, which is responsible for the broadest form of social inequality in China, can hopefully be ameliorated. Of course, this is now urgent, with the rate of urbanization in China reaching the 51% mark in 2011. The next phase of economic and social development will be focused on the urbanization of its rural areas. As recent as last year, Premier Li Keqiang announced that the state's urbanization target of 70%, which will affect 300 million people by 2025, will come not from the expansion of large cities, but from the growth of rural towns and small cities in China. So as a continuation of the Building a New Socialist Countryside program of 2006, it was developed against the backdrop of rural unrest and the urgent need to secure food production. So this drive was to attempt to reverse the migration of the rural populace to the city and to uplift the living standards in the rural areas. At present, this form of urbanization can be divided to three categories. The first one is the redevelopment of villages that are stranded in the city into higher density developments. The second one is the destruction of villages to make way for urban developments at the edges of the city. And the most recent one, the third one, is actually the wholesale demolition and amalgamation and rebuilding of villages into new agriculture towns. So one striking feature of the landscape of the countryside in China is that unlike North America, where vast farmland is dotted by small farmhouses every 1 or 2 miles, is that in China, the rural landscape is fragmented with blotches of dense villages. This is the result of collectivization after the Communist Revolution of 1949, where farmland was owned by collectives and urban land by the state. And after China's economic liberalization in the early 1980s, with urbanization as its key economic driver, the migration from rural to urban was the largest the world has ever seen, to a total of 340 million net migration from rural to urban in the last 30 years alone. And the direction of migration, of course, is towards the coastal cities of China. The white in the pie chart represents actually the portion of urban population with rural status. So in some cases like Shanghai, the white is actually close to half the urban population with urban registration. This status is significant because every Chinese citizen is either an urban resident or a rural resident. To control population movement, especially rural to urban migration, the state implemented the household registration system, or hukou, in 1958. It is actually a two-part internal passport for all Chinese nationals determined by place of registration, basically the residence, and type of registration, which affects employment. So therefore, employment status is inherited through the mother. So each individual is thus conferred a position in society. A birthright for some, a curse for those born on the wrong side of prosperity. So this household registration enacts the binary structure by controlling grain supply, non-staple food and fuel supply, housing, means of production, access to education, employment, medical treatment, pension, labor protection, military service, right to marriage, and even childbearing. In all but the last, urban residents have the advantage. So in sum, migration between rural and urban is controlled not only through the provision of public goods, but by the most basic right to exist. A rural resident will not have access to public goods in urban areas, and vice versa. So the combination of the hukou system and migration of rural residents to the city in search of work have caused the broadest form of inequality in China today. This rural to urban migration also have other consequences. It leaves the fields untended in the countryside, and also children of migrants, workers, are left behind with their grandparents in villages, as they will have no access to public amenities in the cities. So therefore, the state addresses this imbalanced development between the rural and the urban. So the drive is actually to safeguard agricultural land, to, as you can see, to improve the living condition of the rural areas, to stem the flow from rural to urban, and if possible, to even reverse that flow. And of course, to increase the GDP and the well-being of rural residents in the rural area. So from 1951 to the present day, there has been 3 fundamental reforms of rural China. I won't go into detail because of the lack of time, but just 3. The first is the collectivization of farmland that gave rise to the various collectives in rural China during Mao's rule. The second, during the rule of Deng Xiaoping, saw the implementation of the responsibility system, where farmers are allowed to sell their surplus crops after contributing a fixed amount to the collective. And the third, which is just recently in 2006, is that focus on the and in which we also focus on the last fall, is the implementation of the broad policy term building the new socialist countryside. So the new socialist countryside goal, as outlined by Wen Jiabao when he first announced it, is to bring about a rapid and significant change in the overall appearance of the countryside. It calls for the modernization of agriculture operation and the acceleration of the development of rural infrastructure. So this has led to to various proposals, but one of them, the creation of a new agriculture town in Henan province, is a response and interpretation of this broad policy. Situated in Zhongmao County at the outskirts of Zhengzhou, and in particular example that the studio worked on, the current plan calls for the demolition of 4 villages to form a new agriculture town with a combined population of 4,400 people. So the site is well positioned, just 1 hour away from the city of Zhengzhou, and it's closer to the airport than the city itself. So Henan, some of you may know, is the agriculture heartland of China, and Zhengzhou is the largest city in the province. Logistic and light manufacturing are fast becoming an important economic generator for this region, due in part to Zhengzhou's location at the crossroad between north-south and east-west transportation routes in China. So another example in the same county, which is Tushan New Agriculture Town, now almost complete, was created from the demolition of 4 existing villages, Tushan, Nyanlut, Tangjia, and Lejia, and will contain more than 5,500 residents. So the layout of Tushan New Town is strictly urban, with an efficient grid. Semi-detached houses are laid along east-west streets with main living rooms facing south. The north-south grid is the main vehicular network, and all amenities, markets, school, entertainment halls, and so on, are located in the landscape strip in the central spine of the town. Individual housing units are landed on equally sized plots, and the local government grants housing units to each household in exchange for half of the household agriculture land, which is owned within the collective itself. So the Local Design Institute has envisioned the new agriculture town as a wealthy suburban enclave. The courtyard, the quintessential component of the village house, has been replaced by a garage of luxury cars. The expanse of agricultural land that formed the pastoral landscape of the village has been substituted by a manicured, artificial and ornamental landscape of rocks and water. Such a vision is obviously far removed from the way of life of the villagers, more insidiously demolishing and reconstructing the edifices of a village by means of the same logic that has fueled the speculative urbanization of the developmental city, obliterates the essence and beauty of the Chinese countryside. So evidence of the way in which these spaces will be used could be found not too far away. In another newly constructed and occupied new agriculture town, Matushuku, located just northwest of Zhengzhou, this new agriculture town has the same layout, housing types, and amenities. When we visited this town back in fall last year, residents in the town lamented that the dwelling's insular layout and the abandonment of a generation-long connection, not just a physical one, with the agriculture fields. So it's not surprising to see that the villagers actually continue to grow vegetable and fruit trees in leftover common spaces or pavements that are not tiled over to regain this association and connection with the land. Access roads that were designed to guarantee a smooth ride for luxury cars have been now turned into drying areas for corn and other produce. This street thus becomes an extension of town square common spaces for villagers to sort and dry their harvests. And close by stands a newly designed communal hall, now left empty, its glass door shattered, rubbish carpets the main entrance. So the residents of Matushuku, grandparents and elderly parents, actually do not farm for economic necessity, since the town relies largely on remittance from adult children working in the cities. Rather, they tend the land for cultural and social reasons, born from a millennium of tradition and philosophy that sees existence as a unified oneness between humans and nature. So since the cultural value and the social history of the countryside endure in the collective imagination of the villagers, we thought that it is actually irresponsible to transform these rural settlements into cheap versions of wealthy suburbs that are severed from the essence of the reciprocal relationship between nature and humans, landscape and dwellings. So the current approach has disconnected the villagers from their role as farmers, a situation with both economic and cultural implication. First, the new homes they have received in return for their agricultural land are inferior investments. Houses in villages considered as real estate are unproductive and unlikely to rise in value significantly, especially compared to residential properties in the cities. Second, villagers have lost cultural connection to working the land and the social solidarity that comes from collective farming. So the alternative to this tactic is to actually compact these villages less and to incorporate the half of the farmland that the villagers still own into the layout of the new town. This method achieves the goal of increasing agricultural land for efficient and mechanized farming and sustain the existing livelihood and occupation of the villagers. The strategy also promotes 2 types of farming: on the release and regularized farmland immediately outside the new town, and for land-intensive crops like grains can be planted and tended mechanically, increasing therefore the overall yield. And higher value cash crops can be planted on smaller pieces of redistributed farmland within the new town itself. an approach that integrates smaller-scale organic vegetable gardens and fruit orchards into villages' new dwellings. Small processing plants on the periphery of larger new towns can transform the larger scale produce into more valuable products, for instance, wheat into noodles and so on. So likewise, villages could establish weekend farmers market, attracting city dwellers to increase the worth of their produce, retaining the livelihood of the villagers with a less compact village strategy would increase the GDP of the rural areas in a less concentrated manner. So therefore, to retain the essence of the countryside and to capture its expansive beauty and to sustain the village's engagement with the land through work, leisure, and repose, it is perhaps necessary to acknowledge that the distinct separation, conceptually as well as literal, between rural and urban, human-made and nature, architecture and landscape should be whittled away. In Chinese philosophical tradition rests in fact on this foundation of bipolarity of yin and yang. These two terms can be explained only in reference to the other, unlike those in dualistic opposition. Each term in a bipolar relation requires the other. Yin has no meaning without yang. In Western binaries, dualistic terms are autonomous. Nature can be understood independently from culture. This Chinese polarism is not dialectical. That is, it does not follow the Hegelian progression from contradiction to synthesis to sublation. In fact, in Chinese tradition, yin and yang are not dualistic extremes, not dualistic extremes of light and dark, male and female, but rather points along a movement or flow. So in this manner, each of the terms of a polarism is involved in the other at any given moment of anything, reality, even the universe. It's a shade, gradient, intensity of its other, a mutuality. So if we consider it as a space of mutuality, this entity is the constant oscillation between binary opposite. It is composed as a total environment, one made up of the countryside and the city, the rural and the urban, landscape and architecture, field and farmstead. So, and the other thing that is quite important that the studio teaches, of course, through typological reasoning, is that we feel that the irreducible element of the countryside city is the dominant type of the village, that is to say, the three-sided courtyard house. This courtyard house and its urban counterpart, the Siheyuan, retain the essence of the Chinese courtyard house type. They are made up of several independent pavilions bound together by a wall, and space within it is experienced in alternating sequence of closed and open, light and dark, indoor and outdoor. And in fact, it's an outstanding exemplar of a bipolar type. So, for instance, in the village, the main living pavilion directly faces south, overlooking the courtyard. The principal difference between the city and the country courtyard house is the absence, in the countryside version, of the south or front pavilion. Without this structure, farming tools and carts can pass easily through the front gate and into storage pavilions or the east or the west, and turns the courtyard into a drying area during harvest. So the studio actually had three main propositions, and they could be, and this principal version of the countryside city could be summarized as the frame, the mat, and the punctuated field. So along with their various combination, of course, all three versions are spaces of plural coexistence, like any city. The delineation marks the land undeniably, declaring its very existence, and defining a new agriculture town with a figure owes not only to the tradition of city making in China since ancient times, but arises naturally from the plough lines of tended farmland. Yet this delineated artifact should not be a wall or an unbroken, impenetrable structure, as it is in Chinese imperial cities. So the first version, the frame, as a definable figure, is articulated as a thickened borders, formed by the accumulation of self-similar elements. In Augustine's and Lee's Within the Frame, the figure occurs at several scales. A large outer frame circumscribes the reconstituted village. A smaller inner frame contains the field for a communal farming and a forest. The central area is left deliberately empty of buildings to contain and capture the beauty of the expansive field. The space between the two frames is divided into an alternating sequence of agriculture fields and dwellings. Some of the agriculture fields are shared. Others are an amalgamation of private garden strips. The dwellings are composed of alternating pavilions with small courtyards, breaking down the courtyard house into an even finer grain and drawing nature close to individual rooms. So the organizing element of the frame is repeated and varied, with forms large and small, open and closed, composed of pavilions and courtyards, striated by intimate gardens and expansive agriculture field. The experience of moving through these spaces is an experience imbued with the bipolarity of the countryside and the city. The second type, the mat, uses closely spaced dwelling as the typical component of the agriculture town. Shenzhen Zhu's living in the countryside clearly defines the limits of the agriculture town, but it uses the frame as a loose edge but with a clear edge. The typical dwelling unit is a transformation again of the three-sided courtyard house. The outer walls has been removed and the house is reconfigured to allow the courtyard to extend as garden for small-scale farming. So therefore gardens separate the dwelling units and is a departure from the overly compacted the new agriculture towns that is now built in the area. The mat therefore is less compact than the frame because it disperses open spaces evenly and because the rooms of the two-story dwellings are convertible throughout the season, supporting both dwelling and harvesting. Buildings for shared amenities follow the same typological grain and rhythm of open spaces and they are differentiated only by height. The mat also subjugate roads. As they enter the new agriculture town, they dissolve into the landscape, encouraging traffic to slow as demarcation between street, pavement and landscape becomes less pronounced. The same is true of the forest. As woodland permeates the mat, dwellings are thinned out so that they gradually give way to the wilderness. So movement through the town, from room to courtyard, house to garden, garden to forest, town to farmland, from one polar opposite to the other, is subtly evident, a silent transformation of the propensity of things, as François Jullien would have said. The punctuated field is perhaps the third. The punctuated field is perhaps the most radical of the three types, though only when it is compared to the current model for the new agriculture town. Yu and Guo's the city as a field completely negates the strategy of consolidation and compaction, instead exacerbating the expanse of the countryside and recognizing the sublime beauty of the distant horizon. The punctuated field is organized in nested bands of varying scales. At the smaller scale, dwelling consisting of alternating rooms placed within a band, which extends to a private garden, which then extends further to collectivized bands of farmland. This structure allows each villager to control the amount of land allocated to private or to collectivized farming. At a larger scale, east-west groups of dwelling form another band, this one demarcating an alternation between architecture and landscape. The multiplication of this in the east-west band creates the field. Amenities are conceived as small pavilions within the field. They are spaced at deliberate distance from the dwellings, so that the act of moving from one to the other requires effort and hence awareness of the essence and the extent of the countryside. The intimate pavilions, for instance a funeral hall here, which looks out of the expansive field to the faint horizon, intensify this experience. So these propositions are not simply spatial illustration of theory, nor should they be. Implicit in this conception is the betterment of the rural living environment by means of accentuating the beauty of the expansive agriculture field and the closeness of the distilled typical architecture of the village. If the urbanization of the countryside is undertaken with such consideration, perhaps future generations of villagers will no longer be compelled to leave the rural areas. Perhaps they will become more entrepreneurial and endeavors to attract urban residents to the countryside. It would not be surprising if the shared amenities of the new agriculture town, small and manageable galleries, artist studio, creative workshops, were able to draw visitors for weekends or longer breaks, renting and easily divisible courtyard houses to urban residents seeking repose in nature, is another option for harnessing the countryside city. And with the advent of the sharing economy and sites like Airbnb or Alibaba, this possibility is real, convenient, and affordable. So the countryside city will no longer be an impoverished dust bowl to flee from, but an abundant landscape to flock to. In small numbers, of course, but across the thousands of villages in China. Thanks.
I don't know how you started, but I hope that there's time for a little bit of a discussion. So I'm sure Chantal has already mentioned that tonight we're going to have the follow-up from this this conversation, where we will begin the first of what I hope will be a number of events that the school will hold, somehow exploring different aspects of the role of the countryside and the way in which we think about it, the way that we intervene in there. I think tonight's session is really intended as an opening up of this topic, as a form of kind of questioning more than anything else. So we have Frédéric Bonnet, who will be there, and a number of other participants, Anita, Neil, Jean-Dixon Hunt, I think a number of others who will be there. Chris, of course, will be there. So Chris, in a way, has kindly agreed to do the first session at this lunchtime, because you can also see that the school is engaging with this topic, has been thinking about this particular topic. But there are many other aspects of it. But it would be great if you have some thoughts or questions for Chris. I'm sure some of the students you're the authors of these projects are probably also maybe here in the audience, so you can ask questions from Chris about your own project if you want, which would be nice. But I don't know if there are any thoughts. Just because of time, I'd like to go to you first. Otherwise, yeah, please.
Thank you. That was so fantastic. I'm interested in this exchange you mentioned of the urban dweller looking for respite and rest in the countryside, and the countryside being secure as an anchor in a productive place and a culturally connected place. How do you envision infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, connecting this network?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and it also ties on to the larger strategy. But the immediate thing is that most of these villages that we have shown you, they're actually around 15-20 minutes from the city of Zhengzhou, so you can get to these villages very, very easily. Most of them now are actually along the north, towards the east, from northeast, east to southeast of Zhengzhou city. And in the site that we actually looked at, in fact, some of these villages are even closer to the existing airport. So one could say that it is extremely convenient, both by buses or by private transport. And which also leads to the next observation, that the development of these villages are possible also because of most of these villages, because of its proximity to established cities and also established bus routes or train routes. And of course, with today's internet connection and telecommunication connection that's available to everyone, we could begin to see the possibility that some of these villages becomes towns that would enable work that are once familiar or rooted in the urban environment could now actually take place in the countryside. So for instance, in Japan, for instance, you see that there's a movement now of young creative professionals actually moving out to the countryside because they feel that they can actually work with Skype or with a 3G connection, and that's all they need.
Us here, Frédéric, and then Neil.
Hi, yes, following up on that last point actually, could you talk a bit more about the demographics of who's living in these villages or this town now, and with the explicit or implicit goal of attracting more people to these rural villages, is there, do you see a trend of younger people and families moving back to these rural areas, and how does that change the dynamics of the village?
so the first, there are three questions there. So the first one, of course, as you saw in one of the slides, most of these villages for the past about 10, 15 years, they are mostly inhabited by two generations. With the middle generation missing, essentially the grandparents and the grandchildren, because all these villages survive from the remittance economy. That is to say that parents move to the city to find work. And of course, as we know, for the past 15, 20 years, the economy of China was largely driven by urbanization or the making of cities. So a lot of migrant workers moved out and left behind these two groups. So of course, with the slowing economy, and also the Chinese state knows this as well, to cater for this 340 million migrant workers who have actually no access to public goods and public services will soon become a problem, right? So therefore, one of the intended policy of building the new socialist countryside is to actually stem this flow, right? Is to actually begin to attract some of these rural migrant workers back to the countryside. So that's one movement. Will it attract urban residents? I think it will, but of course not in the scale of, let's say, 340 million on the reverse direction. But as I said, in small numbers, but across thousands of villages across China.
Well, thank you so much for this presentation, which was, I learned a lot, because I was just wondering about talking about China this afternoon, but finally that's good that, no, just because for the experience I have in China is when you move from one city, big city, to the other with 3 hours of high-speed train, you think first, when the first time you go there, you think that countryside is going to appear, and it never appears. It's always like a kind of an endless suburban mixed use there, full of fields and buildings and towers and all kind of infrastructures. So finally here I discover another China. So that was very interesting for me. But the question is more about the projects. There's a kind of ambiguity, or perhaps the question is towards the students as well, in the fact that, let's say, the cities which are proposed are extremely sophisticated, very well designed, by the way. That's pretty skillful. That's incredibly delicate and what? Sorry. That's very common. That's very common, but that's extremely. But anyway, how do the student contemplate it? The informal question. Because that looks like this realm, the imagination of having a kind of very well-designed architecture with this kind of between Mies van der Rohe and Viljoen relationship to the landscape with large windows and something perfectly, let's say, controlled somehow. And we imagine that in this kind of process with small houses, then there will be a kind of totally informal process anyway, even if urban are coming, because the process is totally different than what may happen in the metropolis with private developers and so on. So how I don't know, that's not a trap, but just a question between the extremely defined design and then the process, the living process of what the city could be, and how do you deal with this?
I don't see there's a contradiction, right? That it cannot be so. But having said that, these are just design propositions, and they are not the only design solution to the countryside city. I think what was more important for us was the way in which we conceptualize a strategic approach, right, to the countryside. To me, that's the most important. Of course, different architects, different designers will have a different expression or design expression. So in a way, I would say part of the design proposition is also a subjective response to a larger strategic decision. With the second question, of course, how will it be lived in? Of course, we don't know. They had 4 weeks to work on the design, and of course, if they built it, of course, it will be messier, perhaps it will be dirtier, there will be more loose use of the space, as you have seen, where open spaces are converted to harvesting areas. and so on and so forth. So the transformation and the looseness and openness of the structure, in a sense, calls for that, right? So we try to depict that in a collage and in situation, but yes, I acknowledge that it will be messier. But with regards,
I guess part of the question is about the degree to which that is already incorporated into the design. Because
Yes.
there are examples that we have
Yes.
where the architecture is acknowledging to be incomplete.
Yeah.
And so, for example, you might allow or enable more space to exist for the local community to do their
Yeah.
own. I
Yeah.
mean, I guess part of what you're saying is that the design looks a little bit too pristine, and so somehow intervention by the local community seems harder to imagine than if it was more systematically part of the thinking
Yeah.
process of the design.
Yeah.
That's this.
yeah,
What I guessed in the design is in the plans, is that I think the students, they introduced this kind of question because it's the question of combinations and the way the relationship between typology and variations, for example, I think it is included in. It's very quite skillfully as well. Not only the design, but also this kind of organic, generic way of creating diversity with a grid which is at the beginning very straight. I think that was appearing somehow through. I agree with you.
So, Neil, but maybe if there are some of the students, you could get ready to respond also from your perspective. Neil, please.
So, Chris, thank you. Really, as always, really interesting stuff. I mean, I think it's really exciting because it's like you're embedding questions about design strategy within an analysis of a rapidly changing context. And that's what we have to do. We need both. We need the sophisticated design intervention, and we need an analysis of these rapid changes. So my questions are kind of, pushing that project forward, hopefully, and they're under the rubric of how do we conceptualize what's going on and how we're trying to change it. And it won't surprise you that I'm going to ask this, but I'll just put it on the table so that it's there. And it's basically, why do we want to call this the countryside? Like, why? I mean, I know the government is, and I know that's part of the discourse, but does it really make sense? I mean, a couple things. I mean, first of all, in the exchange already, in a way, it reminds me of Megalopolis, 1960 whatever, when John Gottman wrote that book, where the erstwhile countryside of the northeastern seaboard is being encompassed within a rapid urbanization process. So areas that formerly had the fabric of an agrarian society are being encompassed within a suburbanizing, decentralizing landscape. So the fact that these zones are so proximate to a large city suggests that it's more like, in social scientific terms, peri-urbanization, or some variant thereof, than the countryside, even if the dominant cultural landscape and discourse is connected to that. I mean, later tonight, obviously, we'll be listening to Raymond Williams, and that'll be on the table. But I think I don't know the answer to that, because we've got to deal with the dominant discourses that are out there. So that's a dilemma that we have to confront. But some of us might argue, well, put that discourse aside and come up with a different language. And then kind of a second issue that connects to that, which has to do with just the political economy of agrarian restructuring in China, which is so interesting and so central to your whole analysis. I mean, I don't know that history very well, but obviously the Cultural Revolution is all about land reform and radical transformation of agrarian production systems in China, and economic liberalization embraces like a rapid industrialization strategy that's connected to urbanization. So there's a whole kind of mosaic of land use restructuring. And a lot of the design strategies that you're proposing have to do with, they presuppose a broader restructuring of the agrarian economy. So it's just kind of an invitation. I mean, I know it's a very complex issue, but in terms of just the different land use systems that your designs advance. Some of them you briefly mentioned are kind of market-oriented production. Some are for local consumption. And in the context of arguably a more general restructuring of agrarian supply in China in a global context, in terms of much of China's food consumption now being supplied externally rather than produced internally. So all of these built environment changes are connected to that. So would it be, I don't know, from my point of view, it would be illuminating to connect these design proposals to some of those political economic changes so that we can understand their potentialities and also their constraints. So many issues there.
Maybe some of it will be. Thanks, Neil. It's incredibly provocative and precise critique and question. Maybe let me just address to the first comment. I agree with you that we struggled actually to find a convincing term to this project, because I don't think within the discipline we have come up with tools to describe, tools to work, to research, but also to name this. That's why the closest that I thought that at least momentarily could make the proposition justice is to call it a countryside city, right? And when I say countryside city, I term it as I mentioned, it's a bipolarity between two terms, right? And when I use the word city, I also don't mean the city in terms of its scale or in terms of its density and in terms of its infrastructural concentration. What I use the word city more is with regards to its most fundamental definition, that is the city is a space of plurality, as a place of coexistence, it's a space of stimulation, of prosperity, but not necessarily with the density and et cetera, that we are so accustomed to in the language and lexicon of urbanization. So I agree with you in the sense that there is no convincing term as such, because I think we are at the very beginning of an attempt here to perhaps create another term. If it's not urbanization, then is it ruralism? And what are the terms and tools that we begin to approach this? So that's the first one. The second one, I think I've briefly actually mentioned in the beginning of the discussion. There were 3 reforms in the countryside. Of course, after the communist revolution, in the countryside, all land in the rural areas are owned by the collectives, and urban land is owned by the state. So, and that persists today. And of course, from Mao's era to now, there is the land ownership has not changed much, but there's certain incentive after Deng Xiaoping to make agricultural production more effective and align more to marketization. So what's happening right now, you see, is actually an attempt to make agriculture fields more efficient. That is why the state is actually demolishing these patches of villages, accumulating them in one concentrated area so as to release a larger agriculture field so that they could be mechanized and made more efficient. Now, of course, the consequences, as we see now in the examples that I've showed you, is that the villagers, of course, have to give up their land, and they lose that connection to the land that they have worked for thousands of years. So that's one of the cultural and social implication. The other implication, of course, is that is it a good idea to actually compact all these villages into a model that we are so familiar with, is this so-called luxury suburban villa models that we see in the West. So these are some of the consequences of that transformation, and some of the design proposition and strategy actually challenge and resist that, to say that we do not need to compact all of this, we do not need to move towards suburban villas. There is a continuity and persistence of a dominant type that has served the countryside well, and it's the recuperation of that flexibility and the ability of that type to accommodate change and accommodate change in a season, from season to season, that makes this proposition hopefully resilient.
Are there any students here who took the studio? Nobody? Or you're just not raising your hand? Any other thoughts or comments or issues that you think we should for sure discuss tonight?
On this aversion to the idea of the suburban. The Economist last December had a critique that it's not the great urbanization, it's the great suburbanization. And I mean, there is a term that exists for this smushed between rural and city, and it's the suburban. And I just wonder, can that be recuperated and not be such a toxic concept?
That's okay.
So a fundamental difference between that suburbanization process that Neil refers to, the American experience versus this, is that that was actually a post-agricultural landscape, and it was a successional forest that was very much a cultural void. Fundamentally different than this. What I find very interesting about your proposal is, in fact, that it densifies. So unlike that sort of cultural successional void of the successional forest in the Northeast, where the houses were either plopped in this forest that has never been cultivated as such. That's another fundamental difference. Here we have, at least as I see in your proposal, a much denser pattern of settlement in order to work with the aggregation of a still productive landscape. And that's, I find it's extraordinary, and it's fundamental difference from what we saw here in the East Coast. I had a question about, and by the way, I have to say that in post-agricultural landscapes here in the East Coast that were lying as fallow land, when they did those suburban developments, say on the hands of Toll Brothers, or what I'm talking about, one of the ways that they would pay and finance those developments was to actually scrape the topsoil, which was very, very valuable in terms of capital, sell it off, and from that begin to insert all of the infrastructural things. And that left the possibility of the restoration of that landscape to sort of trees in buried, basically, flower pots. In other words, it ceased to be a kind of working landscape from all points of view. I had a question about how this was set up socially. You partially answered that by saying these are collective land ownership patterns. Would that remain like that? I didn't know, I came in late, apologies, but I was hoping that you would in fact not be duplicating the pattern of a social class made by a wealthier urbanite person that comes here and is, so to speak, above the labor, because we're looking at labor nevertheless, and whether there would be opportunities for the local laborers to kind of rise up in an urban way, in the same way that the people that are coming here would be.
Yeah.
So that social hierarchy is not preserved.
Yeah, yeah. So I think, Anita, thank you for answering the question on the suburbs, right? I think it's essentially, if I have to summarize, it's essentially if we look at the suburbanization of maybe in Great Britain or in the States, is that the landscapes are not productive. This is explicitly productive, right? In which you do not drive from town to countryside just to live. Here, you could live and work in that sense, to put it in very almost succinct way.
The question was looking at suburban and not trying to extend the historic
Sure.
concept of the suburb, but to look forward. And so it's not saying that a suburb in the future, east or west,
Sure.
would be productive.
Sure. In that sense, yes, right? In that sense, yes. But I think, of course, fundamental difference here is that the land is collectively owned, right? So some villages, they amalgamate those land, and you own a certain mu, depending on how many sons you have, and that is in paper terms, right? You have that land. Some actually it's demarcated physically where your land is. And in some of this proposition is that we resisted to actually say that the farmers and their families should give up this land to mechanize farming and to then confine all their existence into this suburban villa. So I think in this proposition, we begin to merge the land that is currently held by them to be incorporated within their living type. We would call it a three-sided courtyard house. But there's also a possibility that plot to plot could also be amalgamated so that bottom-up collectivization could also occur if there is a need. So I don't think any of this proposition calls for an urban dweller to come over to buy this over. Yeah, that's controlled anyway by the hukou system or the policy.
So Chris, I just want to thank you for a wonderful beginning to our mini conference tonight. If you haven't seen the work from Chris's studio of the last 2 years, this is the 3rd year, I would really urge you to look at that material, to look at the reports, in part because I think that they are very systematic studies of different urban conditions that are happening in China and how a studio at the GSD can really look at a very particular condition over a semester and produce a body of work that really contributes very specifically to our understanding of those of a situation in China, but also that it uses certain methods of thinking, of approach, of design. So I think it's simultaneously sort of trying to make a contribution to a contemporary situation, but also in a way innovate or understand the mechanisms by which architects and urbanists and landscape architects can think through some of those themes. That's why we thought it would be a really good way to kind of begin to use this material to begin the discussion. I would really welcome all of you to come tonight. I think it would be very interesting precisely because as a school we are facing these whole issues of what is the scope of our work? What is the place where we're intervening? And already you can see, 2 or 3 faculty in this room beginning to articulate nuances of difference of what is the territory of intervention in a way. The whole debate around, let's say, city and regional planning. During my day, it was all schools of city and regional planning. There was no such thing as a planning department in a way. I mean, there were, but they were always part of something much bigger. Then there were regional studies programs, things like that. And I think as we've gone on, the way in which actually the schools think about the domain of thought, the domain of intervention, what is the territory, what is the place that we work, but then also what are the ways in which is really critical. And I think that we have spent so much time focusing on the discussion of urbanization. This is very much part and parcel of that discussion. So the nuance of the way in which we enter the scene, the role of architecture, the role of landscape, the role of planning, the whole discussion of the social is going to require some level of rethinking in a way. And that's part of our attempt by trying to open up these things. So I really urge you to try and be there at 6:30. I think it's going to be very interesting. We will see a variety of different presentations. And of course, as I said, Chris will also be joining the panel there. So we'll see you tonight. And once again, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you.